All right. Welcome back to another lecture. Um, Hopefully, at this point, you have already watched the regular PCA lecture because today we're going to talk about the kernel version for this. So for this lecture, I'm going to split into three lectures. So three separate videos: a kernel PCA lecture, a kernel LDA lecture, and a kernel ridge regression. So today I think we'll do the PCA one. So make sure you understand the basics of kernel. So make sure you watch first lecture on kernels. Make sure you understand the Moore-Aronszajn and the representative theorem. Like these two we're going to use in today. So you're not going to understand what we're talking about. Okay? Especially PCA. So go over the basics of PCA first. Okay, so this is part one, and we're going to talk about basically kernel PCA. Well, the idea of um, kernels is that you essentially have some kind of data, right? Imagine this data space. Every single point in this space is a potential data you could encounter for whatever application you're doing. And over here is what we call the RKHS, the function space. And once we map a single point in here, this right here, remember we talked about how this is a function and it's represented by a vector. Therefore, over here in the data space, it is a vector, and over here it is also a vector. So one way to interpret this is that in points in the function space, every point is a function. But another way to interpret this is that essentially this point is an alternative representation, right? So there's this thing called one-to-one mapping. It means that the point here is mapped to a point here. Therefore, this point is the equivalent version of this original point in a different space or in a different dimension. So, so this like one-to-one equivalent mapping allows you to think a particular data, a particular point can exist in another space. Let's say here's yet another one. So this could exist in this space, could exist in this space. In other words, you can think of the point inside RKHS as an alternative representation of the original in a different dimension, different space, right? So in this space, it's the original space. Over here, it's in a curved space where you are like curving, like bending the space, right? So this is the alternative. So one way to interpret the point here is that every point is a function because it's a function space. And an alternative way to interpret this is that this is the identical point with a different representation. That's all. And what we like to do in a lot of models is to map the data from the original representation into this alternative representation. Because while this is the original space, this is a highly curved and nonlinear space. So in this space, if you can essentially perform linear models like linear regression, and it's going to curve the line. Remember, linear regression, right? You're learning like a line. However, in this space, in this curve space, instead of just learning a line, you are learning a line in this space, but you are actually learning a curve in the original space. Okay, so that's what's happening. This by mapping the data into the RKHS, it allows you to run linear models non-linearly. Okay, so a linear regression that looks like a line in this space, the the curve space would look like this in the original data space. So therefore the idea is for many of the algorithm, what we do is we take the data from the original space, map it here, and then just run any algorithm we want in this space, right? And then it allows you to curve the space accordingly. And there are many examples of this. Last time, I think we went over regression, just regular regression. Okay, so in regression, Well, so what do we do? The feature map of a kernel projects the data into potentially infinite dimensional space. We would project the data to some space. In those cases, it would be impossible to compute the feature map because there are infinite of them. So we applied this thing called the kernel trick, which allow us to use the kernel function to compute the value. We saw from a kernel regression. So this was just a regular regression. And once we map the data to our caches, we we often solve problems that look like this. And if it's a finite number of feature maps, I mean finite number of basis functions, then you can just solve a W, right? You can solve this via gradient descent, or you can solve this via closed form solution. However, the problem arises when when there's infinite bases, then the phi would be an n by infinity matrix times W equals to Y. And obviously, you can't calculate an infinite matrix. So that's where the kernel trick comes in. So this was from a previous lecture. So this should all be a review. So, well, if we think of this in terms of kernels, from the representative theorem, we know that W is equal to the linear combination of all the data in ArcHS. Therefore, this together is the definition of a kernel matrix. Hence, in kernel regression, all we're really doing is finding the coefficients. Okay, so and now a kernel matrix is an n by n matrix, which means that all we have to do is find n vector size of n for alpha. So this is a review from the second lecture on kernels. So we're going to move from there and apply the same idea. The idea is we start off with the data, right? You're trying to solve some kind of regression. We then map the data into ArcHS. So this is an alternative representation. Okay. Once we have the alternative representation, we will end up solving for W in this alternative representation. However, very often phi can have infinite dimensions. If that's the case, then we have to use the kernel trick to create the kernel matrix and solve it that way. So that's the general idea. And we're going to apply that for PCA as well. So like the same idea could be applied for PCA, LDA, ridge regression, SVM. All of these follows the exact same formula. You map the data from the original space to the function space. Then you run all these models exactly the same way, just in this space. And in order for you to solve it, you use the kernel trick to help you. Okay. All right. So PCA. If you took my lecture on PCA, you should be able to see that this, like, you should remember this is the objective. Essentially, we're trying to maximize the variation. So, so if this is the objective, remember we basically just run exactly the same thing, except we map the data from the original space to RKHS, right? So we map the data to this. So the objective is simply replacing each x with phi, right? Replacing x with phi. That's all you really have to do. The only problem now is that because phi could potentially be infinite dimension, we use the representative theorem to set that to v, because we know the optimal solution has to be that. So now we have this. Well, this right here implies this is a kernel. This is a kernel. So we now have an alternative problem. If we just let k c k equal to q, now we have an equivalent. We have an equivalent objective of as PCA, right? So remember, PCA looks like that was the Q for PCA. So now the Q is slightly different. That's the only difference. And then we can now find PCA. And just like PCA, we will essentially find the eigenvector, most dominant eigenvector of Q. That would be your alpha vector. Now, if you want to project more than one dimension. So if you just pick one, then you're projecting it down to one dimension. If you're projecting down to two or three or four, then you want to pick the two, three, or four most dominant eigenvectors, implying eigenvectors associated with the largest eigenvalues. Okay, and that's it. Actually, kernel PCA is really easy. All right. So once you know the alpha for kernel PCA, right? So we found, I think, well, it's F star here, but remember that V is the F star. So let's say here, right? In kernel PCA, we are trying to find, in PCA, you're trying to find this V. And that this V, which we call F here, it's the same thing, is from the representer theorem equivalent to phi transpose alpha. Okay? So using this, now we use the reproducing property. The reproducing property, let's say you want to take this sample and you want to project it down to a lower dimension. Okay, and this is the function from kernel PCA that you learn to do this. So this will project this sample down to a lower dimension. How do you go about doing that? Well, the representer theorem says that it's equivalent to this. Once you have the representer theorem, we know what F star is. It's equal to this. So here it is. Now, this phi transpose matrix is simply phi 1, phi 2, all the way to phi n. If that's the case, then you can multiply this and distribute them, resulting in phi x hat. Remember, this is your input. This is what you input into function. And this is your data. First sample, second sample, all the way to the end sample. So essentially, we'll plug this in into here, here, here. Okay. Now, once you do that, this is by definition the kernel function. So the kernel function, you're calculating the kernel function where one of the input is the data sample and the other one is input to the function. So this is a summation. When you project this down, it's a summation of the kernel functions. So notice this right here is n samples. We're going to add up n samples, and we know what the alpha value is. The alpha value is the result of the kernel PCA. And then once you know the alpha value, you just plug this into here, and you have the result. Now, this is if you have the project down to one dimension. So this is the most dominant eigenvector. Now, if you have project onto two dimension, you have to pick the two most dominant eigenvector. Therefore, you have to repeat this again. Instead, this time you use the second most dominant eigenvector as alpha. Okay, and that's actually it. There's not much. Once you know PCA and you know the theories of kernels, kernel PCA is actually really easy to derive and understand. Okay, so I wrote the code for you guys to study. You can try to study this code here, and what this code essentially does is is that it generate bunch of examples. So for this for example over here is an example of a curve, and when you compress it so that it becomes a line, right? Notice how you're going to compress this area and this will become really small, and this will be the spread out area. You can see how when we project this down to a single line, it looks like this. Okay, if you had project this onto like onto a regular PCA, then it won't compress this area, so that the red will probably end up here and the blue will end up here. So you can see how the space instead of projecting onto a line is projecting onto a curve. Okay? So these are the results of kernel PCA. Now, this is just a slight curve. You can really bend the space. Here's another example. Here, we are like projecting it this way. So you're projecting along a line like this. So you're really bending the space. Imagine had you perform a regular PCA, right? If you perform regular PCA, then they could have just all mixed together, the red and the blue. Um, Alternative, I guess you could do it perfectly like this, but but it depends how the data goes. But the point here is if you use kernel PCA, instead of projecting onto a line, it's projected onto a curve, which end up looking like this. Okay, so this is the advantage of kernel PCA, and I think that's it. That's it for the kernel PCA lecture. I will move on to part 2 later on kernel LDA, but make sure you watch the LDA first before you move on. Okay, bye.